Okay, hello everyone and welcome to our first Psychoanalysis Society event of the term. So since I see we have 220 people at the moment, I guess there is some reason to actually introduce the society because a lot of you are probably coming to our events for the first time. So the Psychoanalysis Society is a society um, basically developed by students at University of Essex Department of Psychosocial and Psychonic Studies. And my name is Greta. I am the current president of the society, and I'm also joined by Josh Pawar, who is the secretary of the society. And today we have the honor of introducing a very, very interesting guest, Dr. Cadell Last, who I will introduce now. So Cadell is a lecturer at the School of Thinking at the UB, and he will discuss neuroscience and psychoanalysis as it relates to the difference in their approach to subjectivity. So while both disciplines are in a way concerned with nervous system dynamics, neuroscience operates on a reduction of the subject to the materiality of the system, mind as brain, whereas psychoanalysis attempts to situate the subject through problematic discourse, mind as wish fulfillment. One may even say, Cadell argues, that this problematic discourse appears in the absence of perfect neurology. From this perspective, psychonic knowledge may provide significant value to understanding neuroscience as a socio-historical community attempting to map and perfect the brain or nervous system as a whole. So as I mentioned, Cadell is a lecturer at the UB, but he's also an anthropologist and philosopher with an interest in human evolution, historical phenomenology, psychoanalysis, and their various intersections. Cadell published academically on topics ranging from metasystem transitions, big history, political commons, and dialectical logic. He is the author of Global Brain Singularity, which is based on his PhD thesis on the philosophy of future potentiality, and Sex, Masculinity, and God, which is a trialogue project discussing concepts of sex, masculinity, and God dialectically with two other authors. Lastly, Cadell is also directing a company at intersection of psychedelics and psychotherapy called New Leaf. So, Cadell, you're doing a lot of things. So maybe before you begin with your presentation, you could provide some insight into how you moved from the study of anthropology to psychoanalysis to give a bit more sense and context to our audience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction. I do have a little bit of context for myself, my history, and how I've come to psychoanalysis. So I'm just gonna share my, and I'm overwhelmed by how many people are here, but this is exciting. So let me share with you a little bit. I'm gonna share my screen and then get into that. So the paper is titled The Difference Between Psychoanalysis and Neuroscience. In principle, it's just a simple question, a simple dialectical question. It is a paper that actually I've been working on for about 2 years. And finally, it's almost ready for publication in the Journal of Neuropsychoanalysis, and a preprint of it is available on my website. But it's been a long process, and I'm really grateful to you, Greta, and for the University of Essex to host this talk. It's a great honor and a culmination of a long process of thinking for me. So here's my background. Basically, Greta gave you a little bit of my background. Here's an overview of what I've been doing and how I've come to psychoanalysis. So I just finished my doctoral thesis about 1.5 years ago on the singularity, which focused basically on an anthropological theory of the singularity. So basically the future potential of technology as it relates to the subjective perspective. Oftentimes when we hear about the singularity, it's from the perspective of people who are in the natural sciences and who are involved in technological development, but are oftentimes not really embedded in either anthropological or historical or psychoanalytic knowledge. So that was really the goal of my thesis. And then the more I wrote, the more I had, the more I was coming close to finishing my thesis, the more I came to appreciate that I was coming to philosophical questions which required a psychoanalytic lens. Basically, I needed to understand the unconscious to understand human desire. I needed the unconscious to understand deep metaphysical questions which I felt were unanswered in the natural sciences. So I started to explore these metaphysical questions on a YouTube series, which you can find online. It's all online, where I explore Less Than Nothing by Slavoj Žižek and also What is Sex by Alenka Zupancic. And I'm massively influenced by both of these thinkers who basically are offering the contemporary world a psychoanalytically informed philosophy. In my view, psychoanalysis is one of the most important forms of knowledge for contemporary philosophy, almost as if the contemporary philosopher will benefit from, in terms of philosophical thinking, if they are able to go through the development and the understandings that have been produced by psychoanalysis. And from this exploration, I, as sort of a postdoctoral project, am teaching at the School of Thinking a course on dialectical thinking. And how I merge philosophy and psychoanalysis here is I apply dialectical thinking to embodied contradictions of personal development. I basically, I'm trying to think the way in which it's useful to understand personal development through dialectical logic and vice versa. And then on sort of another project, I'm exploring basically method with psychedelics and psychotherapy. And that's a new project, and that's a new avenue. And I know it's emerging in the popular culture. The intersection between psychedelics and psychotherapy. I think there's a lot to explore here. It's not necessarily relevant to this specific talk, but it's sort of where I am at the moment. So that just gives you a background on how I went from, exploring the future of technology from a human perspective, and then coming to problems of a psychoanalytic nature, problems of desire, problems of the unconscious, and then finding this exploration useful for philosophical thinking. And that's basically what this presentation is going to be. This presentation is going to be the application of philosophy to a higher order problem of the relationship between psychoanalysis and neuroscience, the way psychoanalysis and neuroscience interact with each other, and what possibly can come from thinking about their interconnections with each other. So that gives you a background on me. So here's an overview of the talk. First, I'm going to tell you about the conference I attended where these ideas started to bubble up in my head. Second, I'm going to tell you about the foundations of neuroscience and the foundations of psychoanalysis. Third, I'm going to enter a speculative territory of what would a neuropsychoanalysis look like. Fourth, from this sort of speculative development, I want to highlight how neuroscience frames the hard problem of consciousness, originally introduced by David Chalmers, and how the hard problem of consciousness both functions as a philosophical foundation for neuroscience and which is problematic in light of psychoanalysis. And that if psychoanalysis is brought to the hard problem of consciousness, I really believe there's the possibility for a philosophical breakthrough. In the fifth section, then, I move into what that philosophical breakthrough might look like. And I use the foundation of philosophy, which deals with absence, which deals with nothing, which deals not with the presence of material, like the brain, but the absence of material, and how the absence of material conditions subjectivity. Finally, I go into the conclusion of the presentation where I explore what potentially this neuropsychoanalysis would look like. So first, the conference I attended. It was July 13th and July 14th, 2019 in Brussels. You can see the banner for the conference there and the picture I took outside the conference building. It's very clear and very straightforward. It is the unconscious and the brain, nothing in common. This was a huge conference, by the way, the Congress of European Psychoanalysis. It was, you know, it was huge auditorium rooms. Everyone from European psychoanalysis was there and so forth. And the thesis of the conference, and I want to emphasize that the conference orientation, as well as my own orientation, is Freudo-Lacanian. So that's my ideology. I'm not against other ideologies. It's just that's my bias. That's my ideology. So the Freudo-Lacanian orientation of the conference was that the brain of neuroscience, the way neuroscience approaches the brain, and the unconscious of psychoanalysis, the way psychoanalysis operates the dynamics of the unconscious, have nothing in common. They're not related to each other. They're not synergistic with each other. They're opposites and diametrically opposed. There's no possibility to bring them together. So the more I thought about this, and especially considering I'm doing my doctorate on the future of technology and the relation between the future of technology and subjectivity, I went deeper into thinking about whether or not, and also I have a training in evolutionary science and philosophy, so I went deeper into thinking what the possible relationship between the brain of neuroscience and the unconscious of psychoanalysis might be. And basically the result is this paper and this presentation. So let's go into the foundations of neuroscience and the foundations of psychoanalysis. The foundations of neuroscience is that they're trying to search for a correlate of subjectivity in the materiality of the brain. They're trying to correlate subjectivity with brain images, or oftentimes the word is called neurological correlation, between excitations in the nervous system and subjective experience. The theoretical basis then for the neuroscience is that they're looking at the presence of form. They're looking at the presence of the form of our nervous systems, our brain and so forth. And they can explain the presence of our form with reference to, for example, cognitive sciences, evolutionary sciences, the evolution of our nervous system, the evolution of our species, the way in which the brain functions in terms of neocortex functioning, giving us certain abilities. In opposition to this, psychoanalysis correlates subjectivity not with the materiality of the brain, but unconscious desire. And the unconscious desire functions in necessitates rather a different form of methodology, a different approach to understand unconscious desire. The psychoanalyst is not so much interested in necessarily the evolution of the brain or the evolution of, or the presence or the brain functioning necessarily, but more interested in the present moment and uncensored speech of the present moment. So a subject will present themselves to an analyst, and they'll present themselves to an analyst under the guise of, I'm suffering from a psychological symptom. There's something wrong with my psyche. There's something wrong with my inner subjectivity. And through the exploration of the speech, the frustrated speech, the uncensored speech, basically the psychoanalyst is dealing with something absent, something which isn't there, a form which is missing. Oftentimes in Lacanian psychoanalysis, along something like a lost object, a lost cause, something which should be there, oftentimes a form of enjoyment or a form of satisfaction, which the subject is struggling with simply. So you can see here why the conference I attended would frame these two forms of knowledge as nothing in common. Let's go deeper on the one side to the philosophical presuppositions of neuroscience. Neuroscience operates under the view of a third-person objective view, meaning we can get at the truth of subjectivity through a general abstraction that kind of gets rid of the first-person experience, meaning we can get at the subject through an image of the brain which we can all look at from the outside, an external point of view. From this external point of view, we can start to correlate how human qualities, unique human qualities, are correlated to certain neuronal mechanisms, like, for example, the functioning of the neocortex. And even for psychoanalysts who are trying to integrate neuroscience into psychoanalysis, one of the most popular works probably is by Catherine Malibu. There's this idea that the psychoanalytic unconscious of Freud can be transferred into the neuronal unconscious. So we can get rid of the search for meanings in Freud. We can get rid of the sort of, the mysterious wish fulfillment and so forth. And we can simply explain the unconscious in terms of neuronal mechanisms and evolutionary history. Whereas for psychoanalysis, the first person subjective point of view is irreducible and fundamental, meaning there's no way you can escape the first person point of view to get the truth of subjectivity. You can't get the truth of subjectivity in a brain map from the outside. You have to explore it on the inside. In other words, the truth of the thought and the emotion of the first person subject can't be scraped away or eradicated, or like you could just get rid of this distortion and then you would have the truth underneath. What this means is that, and I think this is a fundamental point, is that all knowledge for psychoanalysis is subjectively mediated. Whereas for science, and this is not against science, but rather that for science, the condition of true knowledge is the eradication of the unique subjective point of view. A classic example would be Galileo and the motion of the moons around Jupiter, that the moons are moving around Jupiter, even if you tell me they're not. It's independent of any subjectivity. So psychoanalysis is in some sense in contrast or conflict with this underlying presupposition of science, because there's always the in itself of the subject and the way in which the materiality, its conditions, are for itself. So to maybe put this in as simple terms as possible, even the knowledge of the brain as constructed by neuroscience is still for subjectivity. It's still for subjects who are trying to understand the truth of subjectivity. It's, in other words, it's the image of the brain is a temporal moment of subjectivity in understanding the truth of itself. You never get rid of subjectivity through identifying with such images. So then, how is a neuropsychoanalysis possible? On the one hand, neuroscience is claiming that it has universal relevance to all first-person subjectivity, meaning we can map the entire brain, we can build technical devices which will enhance our brain, brain-computer interface devices where we'll all be hooked up to devices in our brain and we'll be mediating higher order subjective experiences and so forth. This is all in popular media now, like Elon Musk or big scientific projects and so forth. That basically the claim of neuroscience, and this is, I think, a problem for the psychoanalytic conference I went to, which is if you're saying the brain and the unconscious have nothing in common, you have to explain how neuroscience is developing technology, which in principle, every subjectivity will have to deal with in some way. So what's the connection? What's the relation? And what are the ethical, what is specifically the ethical relationship to our desire, and how we are building a new technological infrastructure that is interacting with the brain in a very different way than ever before in human history. Then on the other hand, you have psychoanalysis, which does claim a third person universality in some sense. Of course, Freud and Lacan would say so. But this third person universality is only possible by going through particular singularity of subjectivity. In other words, you can't get out of, again, this is the crucial point, you can't get out of the first person point of view. You can't get rid of subjective desire. And this is the counterpoint to neuroscience, which is that you can't claim this objective type of science when your own subjective desire is involved in building these technologies, building these new structures, which are implicitly designed to change the very nature of subjectivity, to change the very nature of how we interact as human beings and so forth. So in some sense, you can't escape our desire from the Lacanian point of view, object petit a, or ultimately coming to questions of metaphysical questions of the way in which technology conditions our relationship to sexuality, the way in which technology conditions our relationship to mortality. At different modes of historical being, human beings have related to both sex and death very differently, depending on the technological horizon of being within which we engage in these activities and play out our existential dramas. So there's a lot of philosophical problems here. In terms of conventional ideology, we have the neuroscientist who says, with advances in neuroscience, we don't need psychoanalysis anymore. We could just get rid of psychoanalysis. We could have the neuronal unconscious. We could explain everything in terms of evolutionary mechanisms. In the psychoanalytic ideology, like in the conference I attended, psychoanalytic theory and practice has no relation to neuroscience. So there's no need to interact with neuroscience. Whereas I claim that both of these ideologies are misguided. So the starting questions of a neuropsychoanalysis to me are, how can psychoanalytic, and approaching it fairly from both perspectives, how can psychoanalytic theory and practice inform the development of neuroscience, on the one hand? On the other hand, how do advances in neuroscience affect psychoanalytic theory and practice? In other words, as neuroscience continues to advance, mapping our brain, introducing new technologies that will interface with our brain in different ways, how does this change the way we confront and approach problematics of desire? How does this change and confront the way we understand our existential condition and so forth? So these two questions, as preliminary thinking for the exploration I want to do, on the one hand, I think that by bringing psychoanalytic theory and practice to neuroscience, I think we have a responsibility to do this because we can avoid scientism, basically reducing the subject to a scientific schema, basically losing the psyche in a brain image, which I think is incredibly dangerous, to think that basically the psyche, as understood in philosophy from Aristotle and Plato, can just be connected to a brain image is just weak thinking. It's not really thinking. It's lazy. It's lazy. It needs new philosophical thinking for the nature of the psyche and so forth in the neuroscientific era. On the other hand, how do advances in neuroscience affect psychoanalytic theory and practice? I think the crucial thing is that the history of science shows that the deepening of scientific practice does not erase psychological mystery, but in fact makes psychological mystery even more interesting. In other words, as neuroscience continues to develop, I think the mystery of what we are as subjects will only get more interesting, will only become more perplexing, will only become more, even to use Alenka Zupancic's term, disorienting. So the first question, how can psychoanalytic theory and practice inform the development of neuroscience? I think starting with this unconscious as a wish fulfillment, that the subject is a desiring subject, the subject is a desiring being, and that the subject as a desiring being finds itself within a type of indifferent negativity, let's say. You could also frame it in another way. You could frame it as that the desiring being finds itself in the absence of God. To use Nietzsche's term, we're in the death of God. And how are these foundations of psychoanalysis connected to neuroscience with very simple questions? On the one hand, what is the unconscious wish of neuroscience? What does neuroscience want? And that's a very Lacanian question. Lacan would always say, what does science want? So that's my question. What does neuroscience actually want? And how does this desire of neuroscience structuring the speech of the neuroscientific community and so forth? And I think the answer is pretty clear, pretty explicit, which is that they want digital immortality in building a whole brain emulation, in building brain-computer interface, in building artificial brains. All of these papers are freely accessible online, in popular media. There's no censorship here. Digital immortality, creating new realities, creating entire new worlds, existing in spaces of unbounded, higher pleasure, greater, basically this endless pleasure principle forever, and so forth, which is all explicit. So this foundation, I think, needs to be thought from a psychoanalytic perspective. Like, what are the dreams of neuroscience, and what do they tell us about the potential problems of neuroscience in some way? Potentially even the naivete of neuroscience. So the first here is that what underlies these fantasies, what underlies these wish fulfillments of neuroscience, is this idea that we could completely map the brain, that you could have a complete map like the Genome Project. You would have the Genome Project, you would have the Connectome Project, where you have a total mapping of the brain. And then with this mapping of the brain, you could create a digital simulation of the brain and then upload your consciousness into it, so that we can actually do this is, I think, a contradiction of basic psychoanalytic knowledge. Basically, the idea that we could have a complete map of anything is impossible simply because of the presence of our own subjectivity. As soon as you have a complete map, you eliminate subjectivity. You get rid of it. You just replace the existence of subjectivity with the map. So there's no room for mystery. There's no room for surprise. There's no room for uncertainty. Secondly, this technical enhancement of ourselves, the technical enhancement of our brain, the question here totally ignores any real philosophical foundation for valuation. This idea that we're just going to become immortal beings of pleasure is I mean, it's a little simplistic and ignores, I think, fundamental discoveries of psychoanalysis. On the other hand, when we think about developing these technologies, instead of immortality, what is the possibility of total catastrophe? What is the possibility of having our brains controlled without our knowledge, for example, is a common example? What is the possibility for that we start to actually be malfunctioning beings because the technology is malfunctioning inside our brains and so forth? There are so many different ways that this project could go wrong. There are so many different ways in which this could lead to just enormous ethical dilemmas. So it's not so much that we should stop exploring, but rather to have a more psychoanalytic understanding of where these desires are coming from and how we are basically embedding a certain technic horizon into a system of values. So again, this avoiding, when we apply psychoanalytic theory and practice to neuroscience, can we think really deeply what is called the hard problem of consciousness outside of the neuroscience frame? And alternatively, what might Freud say about neuroscience? So in order to do this, I want to talk about the hard problem of consciousness, because the hard problem of consciousness is underlying, metaphysically underlying, neuroscience. So it was introduced by David Chalmers. The idea is that we have to solve the problem of neurological correlation, that our subjective experience or our qualia can be linked somehow to neuronal excitations and so forth, like I mentioned at the start of the presentation. Whereas for psychoanalysis, this is a very strange way of thinking, because psychoanalysis is always working with the unconscious psyche. So from the psychoanalytic perspective, consciousness isn't correlated with a brain excitation, but rather consciousness is correlated to what I would call embodied problematics. So that the mind in a body is never kind of in a perfect relation. There's always an ongoing tension. There's always an ongoing difficulty or discomfort or unpleasure. So this is why in Freud's work anyway, he starts with analysis of sex or eros and then ends up going into the realm of death or thanatos. So the idea here is, and I when I wrote this, I thought this was a funny joke. I don't know if it's gonna be funny, but this idea that the mapping and enhancing of the brain with this sort of naive neurological correlation framework is really a signifier for the missing phallus, or the signifier for, like that the hard problem of consciousness is a phallic metaphor of some kind, like, and I don't think that philosophers in at least analytic philosophy really think this through at all. So I would propose that the hard problem of consciousness I'd say the hard problem of consciousness is exactly what psychoanalysis institutionalized, which was working the living problematics or the hard problems of consciousness, the symptoms of consciousness. So it's dealing with real subjectivity. It's dealing with our actual embodied being. And in that sense, the hard problem of consciousness is solved not through, again, the brain, but approaching symptoms and symptoms. In Lacanian terms, the symptoms, so suffering and enjoyment, and the way in which we consciously work through our suffering and our enjoyment, and the possibilities of our enjoyment, and the possibilities of enjoying our symptom. So again, the neurological reduction, I think, misses this role of self-positing subjectivity, that any type of connection to the brain leaves unexplained this dimension of subjectivity, which is that we are still suffering or we're still struggling with a certain form of enjoyment. And that the truth of this claim, I think, will be a type of return of the repressed, meaning that the real symptoms of living consciousness and the indifferent negativity of the world are going to return to us as a serious scientific and philosophical problem. And even the image of digital immortality and so forth. I think the image of digital immortality is an unconscious projection to get rid of these symptoms, to get rid of the indifferent negativity of the world. So with this philosophical foundation, I think that we are in good company, meaning that if you look at the history of philosophy and the history of psychoanalysis and the history of science, as I'll get to in a future slides, that the role of absence or the role of nothing is fundamental. I think it's fundamental in Kant. I think it's fundamental in Hegel. I think it's fundamental in Heidegger. With Kant, you have this idea that the pure reason is unconsciously desiring a unity between thought and being. So again, and here he's critiquing pure reason. So basically he would be critiquing absolutely any desire to link our thought with the materiality of the brain as neuroscience is doing. Whereas in Hegel, he would not start with the brain, but rather kind of the dialectics between being and non-being. So you have this type of presuppositionless philosophy, this philosophy where subjectivity cannot be linked with any positive identity, but rather is figuring itself out through what he would call the cunning of reason, the movement of historical reason itself. And finally, with Heidegger, you have the idea that our Dasein, or our being in the world, ultimately comes to the challenge of thinking death itself. In other words, for Heidegger, death is interesting because it shares the quality of being both universal and personal, meaning that you cannot escape from a first-person point of view. You are going to die. You are going to have to go through that process. And thinking the real of that is for Heidegger the challenge of contemporary subjectivity. So with all of this philosophical tradition, we have basically the same message. The idea that subjective experience is not correlated with a present being, but correlated with an absent being. And that the presence of death itself is the greatest challenge for our thinking and the greatest mystery of our subjectivity. On the other hand, not to be too negative or something, that thinking this absence is not a nihilistic gesture, but rather is the true opening of our potentiality for being, meaning that to think this deeply, to think this truly, is to simultaneously bring out what Heidegger would call our own most potential for being. So in some sense, when we connect the subjectivity to a brain, it's not thinking really potential. It's not really thinking what we could be. It's limiting our identity. It's closing this imminent potentiality. Then in terms of psychoanalysis, you have crucial distinction between young Freud and old Freud, between the idea that in the beginning, we have the problems of thought in libidinal desire, the problems of the unity of eros, where we see the neuroses. And then in the old Freud, this coming to death drive, this coming to the presence, this irreducible presence of non-being, death, the inorganic, and so forth. And in Lacan, you have a deepening of this idea with the idea that, in fact, death drive is not simply an unpleasure, but an excess pleasure from non-being itself. So there's a type of excess pleasure, which is not simple pleasure as the neuroscientists are thinking about pleasure, which is directly in relation not to the presence of a being, but the absence of a being. So on the one hand, you have that subject in psychoanalytic tradition, these problems of libidinal subjectivity are found in the impossibility of unity, as also Kant described. And then on the other hand, the impossibility of this unity becoming a source of enjoyment itself. And going deeper into this, I think, is, at least in my reading, one of the crucial points of Lacan. Finally, in mathematics and physics, we also find absence being a crucial turning point in contemporary maths, contemporary logic, and contemporary physics. In maths, you have the idea that there is no infinite number, which creates a paradox that you have infinite infinities. So this absence of infinity, you could say, to make it sort of a theological metaphor, the absence of God opens up the paradox of all of the infinite multiplicity of subjects. In terms of logic, you have the idea that there's no possibility for a complete logical map. So again, this idea of a complete brain map is just simply impossible, logically impossible, because logical completion requires, the basic formula of Gödel is logical completion requires inconsistency, whereas logical incompletion allows for consistency. So you have to have an incomplete map in order to be consistent in your logic. And then in terms of Heisenberg with physics, the basic wave-particle duality, that we can never know the spatial representation of anything absolutely, because in order to have the spatial representation of anything absolutely, you're negating its motion or you're negating its temporality. So all of these dimensions of contemporary maths, logic, and physics, I think, point to the idea that we can never have a sort of knowledge of ourselves independent of absence, independent of paradox, independent of incompletion, independent of our temporality. What all this leads to is, can we, when I say, can we think the hard problem of consciousness outside of the neuroscientific frame? What I'm basically saying is, it's possible that we could connect the hard problem of consciousness to the problem of absence. That going into this problem of absence, and this is also the foundation of a book I recommend by Terence Deacon called Incomplete Nature, that to think the problem of absence fully is to think through some of the deepest philosophical, psychoanalytic, and mathematical problems of the last 2 centuries, and to really get at the foundation of the subject. Alternatively, then, moving back to neuroscience, how do advances in neuroscience affect psychoanalytic theory and practice? I think it deepens the mystery, meaning, how could possible breakthroughs in neuroscience, like I'd mentioned, how can they recondition, reorganize, or reconstrain the possibilities for subjective experience and desire instead of erasing subjectivity? And will the impacts of these breakthroughs have fundamental meaning for the expression of our libidinal attachments, how we express our sexuality, as well as our existential dramas, how we interpret the meaning of our death, how we interpret the meaning of our finitude, how we interpret the horizon of our being. In every different era of subjectivity. These questions change. And I think that in the 21st century, these questions will change enormously. In the transhumanist literature, it's always framed in terms of how would subjectivity organize its life if it did have 200, 250 years to live, for example? What are these types of questions pointing towards? Let me just give an example here of what I'm trying to get at as it relates to sex and death. Sex and death are problems which change in their nature, but they never are eliminated. So in other words, in the early 20th century, as it related to sex, you would have huge problems of unwanted pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, as contributing to the repression of the subject. You would have huge things like infant mortality, scarcity, poverty, as contributing to the repression of the subject. Of course, with technological interventions, political interventions, all of these problems of sex and death have now been changed. The coordinates of our sex and the coordinates of our death are not, it's not like they're unproblematic, but the problems have changed in their essence. Meaning, today, it's not so much that unwanted pregnancies or sexually transmitted diseases repress the subject, but emotional and social problems contribute to the repression of the subject. And it's not so much that infant mortality or scarcity or poverty, at least in the developed world, contribute to repression of the subject, but degenerative diseases and so forth contribute to the repression of the subject and so forth. So likewise, when it comes to thinking our current dimension and thinking possible future interventions, not saying I know, but just this is an open mystery. How would brain-computer interface or whole brain emulation or artificial general intelligence, how would these technologies change the way we form libidinal attachments? How would they change the way in which we engage in existential dramas and so forth? So again, when it comes, and this is coming to the conclusion of the presentation, when psychoanalysis claims that the brain of neuroscience and the unconscious of psychoanalysis have nothing in common, I think that this is missing incredibly important questions. I think there's an importantly rich conversation to be had between people with a neuroscientific background and between people with a psychoanalytic background, precisely because the consequences of neuroscientific technology may have a universal relevance to subjectivity. And likewise, the presence of desiring subjectivity does condition neuroscientific discourse. So the relationship between the two is, to me, interesting. And to basically, this is the conclusion, is that the brain of neuroscience and the unconscious of psychoanalysis may have something in common, but it is this common nothingness. This is the play on words. This common nothingness could lead to a potentially deeper understanding of subjectivity, that by exploring this, we could see maybe a new form of knowledge, which I think neuropsychoanalysis would be. And I'll end here with a quote from Alenka Zupancic, who is an incredibly influential philosopher for me. Quote, "To drop just one crazy idea, if we are indeed nothing more than what a brain scan reveals, but rather something less, brain scans are supposed to make sense and to be at least potentially entirely mappable onto our individuality. But what if they aren't? What makes us subjects of the unconscious is perhaps something that shows only on a brain scan, but cannot be mapped onto anything else. This idea of a fundamental mapping problem where the subject appears here." And again, you can find my research on my website. And I thank you all for your attention, because I know that was a long and potentially complex presentation, but I hope it was also beneficial. It was a labor of love, and the basic method is just to apply dialectical logic to these forms of knowledge and to see what they might have to say to one another. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Cadell, for a very, very interesting presentation. So I would like to encourage all the audience participants to put in the questions in the chat, or just let us know in the chat if you would like to ask a question live, because we will unmute you and allow you to have that possibility. And of course, selfishly, I want to pose a question to you, Cadell. So you might know, I'm not sure if you attended, our previous talk was by Professor Mark Zolms, who's obviously very much invested in the whole neuropsychoanalysis business. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about this debate that occurred and developed between Rachel Blass and Zvi Carmeli, who ignited this very furious debate against neuropsychoanalysis in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, which spurred into, I want to say, over 10 articles now, which keep coming back between Rachel Blass and Mark Zolms. And they argue that neuropsychoanalysis, specifically as it is developed by Zolms, which they conceptualize as a discipline centered around biological reality rather than unconscious reality, because they see the two as fundamentally distinct. So they argue that neuropsychoanalysis undermines the fundamental and unique purpose and tradition of psychedelic theory and practice, which is to interpret and understand in a distinctively psychological way the significance of patients' difficulties through the lens of neurological discourse. So I wondered if you had any thoughts around that debate and in general around this, perhaps sometimes hostility and yeah, I think there's also an element of fantasy amongst some of the psychoanalysts of, maintaining this discipline of psychoanalysis as a very specific kind of discipline, both in terms of its theory and research methodology. So a very broad question.
Yeah, and so if if I were to go into some of the nuances of my presentation, I'm certainly both undermining the idea that we can reduce the subject to a biological reality in a neuroscientific discourse, and at the same time, I'm also undermining the psychoanalysts who think that they can just stay independent and isolated from science. Neither works to me. Both are too reductive in their own way. So my basic claim would be that the starting point for a synthesis would be understanding that scientists are also subjects of the unconscious. You can't get out of it. But that doesn't mean that we should have a historically relative postmodern science. On the contrary, it brings us to a more radical science. It brings us to the science of desire. It brings us to the science of what we want. You see this oftentimes as a problem in like interpretations of literary theory. Like with postmodern literary theory, you can just have a multiplicity of interpretations of the text instead of analyzing the core desire of the text. We should read the core desire of science. What does science want? And what are the consequences of scientific desire for subjectivity universally? So I don't want to basically stay with the ideology of biological reduction, and I don't want to stay in the sort of the ideological madhouse of a psychoanalysis which is disconnected from this. I don't know if that's a good answer. That's my
It falls in line with my approach to it as well. So I'm happy to hear that someone echoes that. Thanks, Cadell. We've got a question from Josh and then a question from David. I hope I'm not butchering any names. So Josh, you go ahead first.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation and the passion with which you delivered it. It was very much enjoyed. So I thought about scopophilia, the pleasure of looking, that Freud commented on in the repressed kind of post-Victorian Britain and Europe. as some sort of sublimation of desire. And I wonder how it could extend to the neuroscience of modern social media and media consumption. Because I mean, I know Zizek commented on cinema being the ultimate pervert art, and how, you know, it teaches us to desire more, and also from a neuroscientific point of view, I wonder if, because I know the hippocampus can change when people work in fields that require vast memorization, like London taxi drivers. And I wonder if we're becoming biased towards the sights and sounds areas of the brain, because that's where the big tech companies can kind of get to us. And I wonder if that will ever kind of, in a kind of subliminal, hypnotic kind of way, get us to act in certain ways, like our other senses get involved, like hacking, human hacking, kind of a bit out there. So I wondered what you thought about like my kind of statements there.
Well, so if I could isolate a question, is it related to that? Are we biased to looking at the subject through areas of the brain because that's where big tech can exploit? I just don't know what the question is.
Okay, I mean, obviously, big tech is kind of like the boogeyman, right? I don't want to kind of reduce it to a conspiracy, but it does seem like we as humans, with more time, at least in the West, to consume rather than create, perhaps as a result of a capitalist economy, you know, we consume all of these things, and all we seem to do really is to develop these areas of the brain, or engage or not engage the brain, you know, the areas that are well, I don't know whether we would engage subconsciously, unconsciously, while we're kind of asleep watching TV. Because I don't know if it's beneficial to be more in it, so more sight and sound dominant, so you can engage with this kind of reality in which we consume a lot, whether it's beneficial to be disengaged and run away from the TV or run away from the computer.
I think I can like, in terms of disengagement, my fundamental mode of being is disengagement. For the last 6 years, I haven't had a cell phone. For example, like my fundamental mode of being is disengagement from the algorithms, disengagement from it as much as I can. Of course, I can't do it totally. I have social media and stuff and blah, blah, blah. But I haven't had a TV for years. But the way in which I think it's because so many people are unconscious in a very low level way, these algorithms can parasitize us so easily that unless you're bringing yourself with consciousness to this environment, as much as possible awareness to this environment, I think it's extremely, you get hooked into these, like we all know, I'm not saying anything new here, you get hooked into these dopamine loops and you just get destroyed by these little loops. So I think that's, to me, my symbol on I have in the book, Sex, Masculinity, and God, I use the symbol of a circle with a gap. And to me, the gap is where you withdraw. In other words, I'm not going to just be this loop controlled by a dopamine. I'm going to withdraw from this and get my awareness, and then I'll decide where I'm going to engage in a more enlightened, possibly, maybe that's too arrogant.
I don't think so. Thank you.
Thanks, Cadell. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions in the chat, and then we have a few people who want to ask a live question. So I'll begin with one question from the chat posed by Edwin, who says, what do you think, Cadell, about the interrelationship between your cross-disciplinary field and entropy/metabolism/biodiversity/consumption of upcoming human patterns of condition? Is the future all too human or less anthropocentric?
Okay, so this is interesting question. So there's two ways I usually go with this, is like, on the one hand, I don't reify the human as this special category. like I don't know, like that like almost like a Rousseauian understanding of humanity, like that we're this great being intrinsically, and that we should stay around forever. I think that both the history of modern philosophy and science point towards that we should assume that humanity will end. I don't know how we'll end, but I don't think we're just going to be around forever. I don't think that's the nature of our being. Like, and I think that's even in Heidegger's Being and Time, that we should go to the temporal, like that being is a temporal nihilation of being. So in that sense, like I don't have anything in the game of sort of, I don't know, preserving the human forever or something like that. Or and on the other hand, I don't have any sort of naturalistic utopianism either. Like, because to me, nature is inherently creative through catastrophe. Like, look at, for example, we've had many huge extinction events in the history of the Earth, many more extinction events and many more catastrophic extinction events than humans have responsible for now. Just that the future, I don't think is going to, I don't think that the future is going to be this humanistic, naturalistic utopia. I think we're heading into something that I only point towards as like I describe it as like an alien otherness. And that my only ethical axiom for it is to bring as much awareness as possible. And I don't know if where that leads us or where that leaves us.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a live question from David. I hope I'm not butchering your name, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask live.
Yes, okay. Can you hear me? Okay. It's very interesting, this it's one of the first time I participate to one of the, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I wanted to make a question about this thing you said about there is a common unconscious between psychoanalytic discourse and neurology. And I want to link this thing you said with something that Zizek wrote in Sex and the Failed Absolute about the singularity, where he specifically talks about the fact that the unconscious is impossible to record because it's nothing. So it's nothing. So it's impossible to record. And that's exactly what's maybe it's impossible to record, because even him wasn't very sure. But if it's impossible to record, then the reality, the real, what we call the real psychoanalysis discourse can survive. If it's instead, it's possible to record, if the machine can record even the unconscious, then it's over. It's over for philosophy, but for so many things, probably for the humanity itself. And so it was interesting, the contradiction, no? Zizek is defending the fact that there is not a common thing between scanning and unconscious. Okay, it's impossible. There is no common thing. And hearing you stating instead that you are hoping there is something common between them, I see here a contradiction, and I maybe it's because we are really facing here an impossibility.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to share what you think about this.
So crucial in both my presentation and Zizek's discourse is that when I say that psychoanalysis and neuroscience may have a relation, I don't mean an absolute relation. I mean a productive discourse, not an absolute relation. And the crucial thing is that in psychoanalysis and in Zizek's philosophy, there is this ultimate, the metaphysics revolves around the non-other, like you say, The metaphysics revolves around the impossibility, and where I would situate what you're pointing towards, which I agree with, what I'd situate what you're pointing towards is if you read, for example, very famous scientists like Michio Kaku on his book on consciousness in the brain, they believe that we will be able to record the unconscious. And so they believe that we're going to be able to have, basically they believe, this is the unconscious presupposition of science to me, is they believe they can get rid of the subject. And I'm saying that this is not possible, that we have to deal with the real of our subjectivity, and that we have to deal with the impossibility of our own hearts. And we have to think this deeply. That would be my, well, that's my, I'm not saying we all have to do that, but that's where I am.
Yeah.
Next up, we have a question from Mika and then Alexandra.
Am I on? Do you hear me? All right. Excellent presentation. A big love, but yeah. This might be a longer point, but I'll try to be brief. But well, I wonder about great deal many things about the neuroscientific framework or the neuroscience mind. I wonder, for example, about how would they ever explain how words can have like a direct meaning to our soma in our body? How do they explain the what Freud calls psychical causation of words on body? And the next thing I wonder is that have they really never read existentialist literature? Since what I'm thinking is that maybe just reading something like Dostoevsky's Underground Man, it would really eliminate their whole ideology. Since this leads to the third point, I wonder why they are so uncritical about their desire to upload the mind into whatever they are trying to. I mean, is it either clouds or whatever? I mean, why are they doing it, and why are they so uncritical about it? Since I have a twisted mind, I have something wrong in my brain, perhaps, since I started to consider the possibilities, like what if something goes terribly wrong, something just goes terribly wrong in the gear, and the whole experience of uploading the mind is just endless pain, and it is like ever growing some like one note of music that just pierces your brain and makes you insane for like forever. Why don't they like consider this as possibilities? So we need to keep the field of possibilities very open, and I think that metaphysics would help here. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you're saying. I think I think, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, one, like, well, I think that Freud starts his career with this weird relationship between our words and the body, and he's trying to restore the magic of words to the scientific universe. And the scientific universe doesn't have a theory of language that makes sense to why we have meaning. That's why we have a so-called meaning crisis is going on and so forth. Or take my favorite technical example for meaning. In cybernetics, you have, for example, information theory, and you have a theory of communication, which is very effective with building our modern technological infrastructure. But it says nothing about meaning. The entire scientific universe opens up, and I think this is implicit in work like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and Lacan says this, is that the entire scientific universe opens up on the unconscious presupposition of eradicating subjectivity. I think that the scientific, the desire of the scientist is to return to the womb. And they don't want to admit this, because if they had to admit this, they would destroy themselves. Their identity would collapse. So they don't do this because it would undermine their identity. And they don't read Dostoevsky. They don't see any value in literature. They don't see any value in existentialism. Neither did Lacan, but but anyway, Yeah, of course I agree with you.
I'm waiting to see if Mika wants to say anything else. But if
No, I agree. It's just big love and understanding and sounds.
We agree.
Excellent. It's quite a rare phenomenon in these society events for people to agree. So it's nice to see that once in a while. Okay, next up we have a question from Alexandra.
Hello, do you hear me? Okay, thank you so much, Cadell, for your presentation. I would like to ask you, because you said there is no possibility of dialogue in a way. I would like to bring an idea and to confront it with you. We know that psychoanalysis and phenomenology are common rooted in Brentano and okay, Husserl, you mentioned Heidegger. I go further, I go to Merleau-Ponty, to the French turn of phenomenology. So what do you think, maybe if we think about this common origin between psychoanalysis and phenomenology, we can, and if we have in consideration the late Lacan, we can, and the late Lacan, I dare to say, was a mystic. We can think about this shift from duality, from dichotomy toward non-duality. So from this point of view of non-duality, from the point of view of, for instance, Merleau-Pontian concept of transparent flesh of the world, or others, yes, Dasein, Heideggerian Dasein, or rien que phénomène, Marc Richir, we can dissolve this opposition between subject and object and go toward non-duality. So from a phenomenological point of view, neuroscience is just a phenomenon, manifestation, but one, how to say, one manifestation of the truth of whatever, parmi les autres, I don't know how to say it in English. So phenomenology is inclusive, and phenomenology includes neuroscience and science as a phenomenon. So it's not a fight, they include it. But neuroscience, they are a little exclusive. We possess the truth. But phenomenology, together with psychoanalysis, they are inclusive. Okay, neuroscience, you are one phenomenon as others, other phenomena. So from this point of view, I think that if we consider neuroscience with desires, with achievements as just a phenomena, it's not a problem, because it's important to question what's the truth. It's subjective, it's first person, I am the truth, or it's an object that I'm studying and possessing. So that's my question. Can we include neuroscience as a phenomena in phenomenology and psychoanalysis?
Okay, so a few things for me. I'm not sure if we can just include neuroscience as just another phenomena because of its ontological consequences. Meaning that if you just say neuroscience is one discourse and this is another discourse and this is another discourse and this is another discourse, and we just have a series of different discourses, it doesn't account for the fact that this discourse, like for example, I don't know, shamanism or whatever the discourse is, some sort of non-scientific discourse, whereas neuroscientific discourse does produce things like brain-computer interface, which does have universal consequences for subjectivity and so forth. So it's a discourse which has ontological, this is the interesting thing to me with science and discourse, is that scientific discourse, although it does ignore the subject, it does also have universal consequences, like, for example, the atomic bomb. Like, it does something different. So it's not just another relativistic discourse. And then in regards to non-duality, for me, I think that psychoanalysis points to something that's like what I call, well, in the paper, I call it, because of the editors forced me to call it, but what I want to call it is non-monism. Non-monism is the absence of the one, meaning that it's not that you just get rid of the subject object for the non-dual, which is like the meditative trance or the psychedelic state or something. But the non-monism is more precisely the impossibility at the core of our love, the impossibility at the core of.
Excuse me, it's apophatism, apophatic, teologia negativa.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
thank you.
In this sense, I think it's interesting still to not treat the subject-object duality as merely an illusion with no ontological consequences, or, you know, I think it's worthwhile still to think through problematics of duality. That's why, for example, in the presentation, I work through psychoanalysis and neuroscience as a dialectical tension between the two, not as we can just, I don't know, reduce them all to a multiplicity of different discourses or something. I don't know, that's my perspective. But I think there's deep, and also in regards to the asymmetry, where, okay, phenomenology is inclusive and neuroscience is not inclusive. I think this is where we should be even more forceful with things like neuroscience, and not even that, forceful with things like theoretical physics. Neuroscience and theoretical physics and the sciences, they always present themselves as if they don't have to deal with philosophy, as if they don't have to deal with psychoanalysis. I think, on the contrary, I think that we should be more bold with our thinking. I think that we should show clearly the way in which phenomenology and psychoanalysis have consequences for the sciences, which they're not willing to admit.
Okay, so I'm very conscious of time. So we've got two people who want to ask live questions. But before that, I looked at some of the questions in the chat and I noticed that there were a couple of questions to do with art therapy and that sort of stuff. So I'll pose the two questions together. Okay, Cadell? So they're from Elena and Claire. So Elena wrote, do you think that experiential exercises, for example, the technique of theatrical therapy, could bring the person closer to his unconscious thoughts and could be a study to measure potentially to the unconscious? And then Claire said, what are your thoughts on the drive to create under the umbrella of both psychoanalysis and neuroscience? Will future technology influence our ways of making art? I'm speaking as an art psychotherapist, and the potential of influencing innate art making is important to me.
Yes. So I think I'll go into some detail, but I'm pretty sure it's a big yes to both questions. So in terms of therapy, I think we all know the mantras of our era, that we're in a mental health crisis or something. We should become more experimental with method when it comes to therapy. And this, maybe you could say, is a critique of psychoanalysis even, like, why not become more experimental with method, like theater therapy or art therapy or whatever, however we can express our innermost desires, however we can stage and discover ourselves through higher levels of relationality in acting, in art, in like when human beings have the possibility of reaching, or literature, when human beings have the potential to actualize their own most potentiality, we do find ourselves in theater and art and music and literature, and that's where we naturally tend. So I think no reason why this can't be explored as a therapeutic mechanism, although I do think that, talk therapy has its place as well. Then in regards to creating under the umbrella of neuroscience and psychoanalysis, absolutely, the technological horizon within which subjectivity creates is absolutely essential. Like, for example, if I lived in a world where I didn't have access to YouTube, I could never have done what I've done. The technological horizon opens up potentiality for being. It just depends on our awareness and the awareness of how we use these technologies. There are so many technologies which open up exploratory creative possibilities. Like, I'm not against, for example, virtual reality or video games or whatever movies, whatever the technology, whatever the medium is where we can explore. Let's go, let's do it. Let's get creative.
Thanks, Cadell. We have two people who wanted to ask live questions, so I'm really inclined to give them some of the time. So Trin, if you're here with us.
Yes, I am. Hello, from me.
Hi, we can hear you.
Thank you. First, and to me, or during that presentation, it came to my mind that maybe neuroscience is like, sorry, again, that people have been striving towards understanding and organizing everything to cope with that insecurity that they are going to die one day, and maybe that that could be the reason why we do neuroscience, but psychoanalytics add the part of the unconsciousness and opens more possibilities. Like, neurosciences might be kind of limiting and explaining, but on the other hand, if we get aware, or if we become aware of that there is something more, then maybe we could also add those, how do you say, neuronal signals, or add something to our awareness. Do you think that's possible?
In terms of your first stream of consciousness, as it related to maybe it could be the reason why the fact that we're going to die one day is the reason that neuroscience have these unconscious presuppositions, I think absolutely. And then because of that, they present this image of ridiculous potentiality, like digital immortality, and they present it as possibility, but really it's the opposite, the closure of it. Like, they foreclose real possibility in this false image. So I think I agree with everything in your train of thought, but I'm not quite sure about what you meant by your last question when it said maybe we could add neuronal signals to our awareness. I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Okay, let me explain that. We, as as we learn, as we see, as we hear, as we are aware of what's around us, we learn new things, and maybe through that we can like broaden our consciousness.
Mhm.
That was
Yeah, I think
what
I think that's so. I think absolutely. So the foundation for me would be, if we're really going to explore new possibilities and broaden our consciousness, we have to be connected fundamentally to our being in the world and our senses.
Yes.
So but again, if we're trapped in these abstractions that we're a brain scan, we're totally obliterating our senses. So there's a way in which again, and I think this is evident in like how I see scientists as beings in the world, is they kind of obliterate sensation. Like they obliterate sensation with a universal image. So I think we should go back to the senses and explore our potentiality of our being in the world, and broaden our consciousness this way.
Yes.
And
for
whatever
sure.
and whatever technologies emerge from science, simply use them as pragmatic tools to extend our creativity. If we want to.
Yes, and I think we also should be aware of that we don't know everything, and that we will never know everything, and that's what makes psychoanalytics so important.
Totally agree. I think there's a funny Zizek joke in Less Than Nothing where he says there's two people. One person says, I have the absolute knowledge. And then the other person says, but you can't have the absolute knowledge. We can't know everything. And then the other person says, that is the absolute knowledge. So again, this absence of this knowing that it's impossible to know everything, if you really embody that, then you got it.
Yes.
So, and then you're free to explore, and it's great. And you might die.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Love the optimism in that one. Right, okay, so I know that there's loads of questions in the chat, to the point where we probably have to schedule a follow-up session to this, Cadell. But I wanted to give the opportunity to Daniel, who wanted to ask a live question, Daniel Garner. So please go ahead.
Cadell, magnificent presentation, enjoyed it a lot. So would you say the challenge we face moving forward technologically is programming an absence, designing around an absence without in the act making it a presence, which would have to mean we negate it, because that is impossible, because there's something essentially absent about subjectivity.
So this is really interesting. Like, what is at stake when we program around absence? I think that, like, for me, what I was thinking about recently, we have this problem that we're being controlled by the algorithms. Like, we have this problem where the algorithms are dominating our subjectivity. It's kind of like the big other in Zizekian terms. And I think that what it means to program around absence would be to inherently design algorithms which are more that are capable of introducing more surprise and mystery. Where the algorithms, like I notice, for example, like if I'm on YouTube, like if I click on a certain video, it will show me then all the same videos, and then I get caught in this echo chamber of videos. Whereas if the algorithms were able to inject more surprise, more mystery, and not randomly, but like somehow intelligently design interesting surprises and mysteries for you to discover, I think this would break apart many echo chambers. This would break apart many ideological phantasms and so forth. I don't know if I mean, I have heard some people at my previous doctorate institute talk about things like this, but that would be my intuition.
So the next wave of big startups we all need to invest in are ones that are going to program around an absence. That's what we're going to do.
Okay.
And I would just add, so it's almost like we need today everyone's pursuing a theory of everything that synthesizes, but must secretly negate, the subconscious that doesn't take it seriously, when really we're not even taking into account the possibility of a theory of everything that must be around essential tensions, or where we're going to have multiple theories of quote unquote bracketed everythings. And by not even letting that be almost a category of a possibility moving forward, we could be taking serious risks that could have negative consequences.
I think it's related to this idea, which I'm pretty sure you know well, which is this idea that in order to really develop your consciousness, you kind of have to fight yourself, or you have to fight your own being. You have to fight your own brain. Right. And so I think that what's implicit in a lot of theories of everything is that they want to eradicate tension. And you can't eradicate tension. And that to me is the mystery of the death drive. You have to constantly maintain tension in an artful, wise way. I think it's also the mistake of Buddhists, by the way, because I think Buddhists also want to get rid of tension, and they just go into meditation and so forth, and they withdraw from the world. I think that the real challenge is to maintain tension, to grow with tension.
Excellent.
Okay, and on that note, thanks Cadell for exploring the tensions between psychoanalysis and neuroscience today with us. I hope you enjoyed presenting to this audience. Thank you to everyone who came, 300 people, that's amazing. By the way, we would probably have more. 300 is the cap on Zoom, unfortunately. It doesn't let more people in. So really, really good outcome. And thanks, everyone. I posted the Psychoanalysis Society Facebook page if you want to follow for more events. And we will also post the recording and hopefully the slides if Cadell agrees to it, because a lot of people ask for your presentation slides in our Facebook page and other social media. So thanks very much and bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.